Before we begin, take a moment to note where you're listening from and the exact time on your clock right now. Not because it changes what happened, but because stories like this have a way of resurfacing in patterns, in places, and in moments when people are ready to see what paper tried to hide. And if you're here for accounts that were never meant to survive their own filing cabinets, make sure you subscribe to the channel. In the autumn of 1893, in a county office that smelled of damp ink, coal smoke, and old ledger glue, a clerk opened a bound census volume and found a line that should not have been there. It was neat. It was written in the same hand as the others. It sat exactly where it belonged, between two ordinary households, among names that had lived their entire lives inside the same few miles of river and road. And yet the entry described a girl who, by every rule of that system, did not exist. Not simply missing from the town's memory, not simply unrecorded, she was missing from the one thing that was supposed to be inescapable, her beginning. The ledger said she was alive. The birth certificate said she had never been born. What happens next is not a ghost story in the usual sense. It is a story about the violence of paperwork, about how a nation that trusted ink more than witnesses learned to use documents as weapons, and how one impossible line in a census book exposed a quiet machinery most people never noticed until it turned in their direction. The first time the name appeared, no one celebrated. No one in that office whispered miracle. They whispered trouble. Because the census was not simply a count, it was an instrument. It decided who was seen, who could be taxed, who could be drafted, who could be owned, who could be moved, who could be punished, who could marry, who could inherit, who could testify, and who could disappear without the world admitting it had lost anything. In 1893, paper was not an accessory to life. Paper was life, granted or denied. And, in that world, to be written into a record without an origin was to be declared something unnatural, a mistake, or a fraud, or a threat. The town itself was small enough that the courthouse clock could be heard from the train platform if the wind was right, a place built around sawmills and a freight spur, a place where people measured time by harvest and church meetings, and the rumor cycle that moved faster than any telegraph line. The county seat held a two-story brick courthouse with narrow windows and a basement vault that stayed cool even in summer. The clerk's office sat on the second floor, and the census ledgers were kept in a cabinet that had been repaired too many times, its doors uneven from years of humidity. The clerk's name does not matter here, because the point is not the man. The point is what he did when the paper contradicted itself. He was not a visionary. He was not a reformer. He was the kind of person the system relied on, careful, obedient, proud of neat handwriting, proud of routine, and proud of being the one who kept the county's memory in order. On that day, he was comparing household tallies against the prior enumeration, a task that sounds dull until you understand what it meant when something didn't match. Discrepancies triggered audits. Audits triggered letters. Letters triggered visits. And visits in that era did not come with apologies. They came with authority and suspicion. In the middle of his cross-checking, he saw the entry. Female, age 9, listed as living in a household that had no children listed in any earlier count. Her surname was common enough to blend into the page. Her first name was not. It was spelled with an old-fashioned flourish, the kind of spelling you only saw in family Bibles. And beside it, in the margin, was a note. Not in the clerk's handwriting, not in the enumerator's usual hand. A separate mark, smaller, as if added later. Verified. That was the word that made the clerk sit back in his chair and listen to the room, because in that office, verified meant someone had already anticipated disbelief. It meant someone had already fought for that line to stay on the page. It meant there had been an argument somewhere, and the argument had ended with the record winning. He did what people in his position always did. He went looking for origins. The county kept birth registers. Churches kept baptism books. Midwives kept their own notebooks, sometimes in code, sometimes in pencil that smudged if you breathed on it. There were cemetery plots. There were death notices. There were family Bible entries copied into probate files. There were school rosters. There were vaccination lists. There were apprenticeship documents for children placed into households as labor. A child might slip past one record, even two, but not all of them. Not if she had lived 9 years in a town small enough that the same grocer could tell you who was sick just by watching who bought vinegar. The clerk pulled the birth register for the relevant years. He flipped carefully because those pages tore easily, and the county had no money for replacements. The surname appeared again and again. Different households. Different branches. Familiar names. But not the child in the census. He checked adjacent years. Nothing. He checked spelling variations. Nothing. He checked the church book for the congregation listed nearest the family's residence. Baptisms were recorded for many children, even those whose births had not been officially filed. Nothing. He checked the school ledger. There were absences, expulsions, children who moved away, and children who died. No match. And then, because he was the kind of man who believed the record should be able to explain itself, he did something the system never loved. He asked a question out loud. He went to the deputy in the next room, a man who had grown up in the county and knew every family story that hadn't made it into ink. He pointed to the line and asked, as casually as he could, "Do you know this child?" The deputy leaned in, squinting at the name, and for a moment his face did what faces do when they're trying to decide whether honesty is safe. Then he said, low like the walls had ears, "I thought they said she wasn't real." That was the first time the clerk felt the chill that would follow this entry into every room he carried it. Not because a child being missing from records is eerie. It happens. People lie, records fail, fires destroy books. But because the deputy's words did not sound like uncertainty, they sounded like repetition, like something said before, something agreed upon, something rehearsed. They had said she wasn't real. Who were they? The family, the church, the county, the people who had an interest in a child not being real on paper. The clerk asked again, more directly, "Was she born here?" The deputy didn't answer immediately. He closed the ledger with one finger as if to shut the child back inside it, and he said, "You didn't hear this from me. But there was a girl. Folks saw her. Then folks stopped saying they saw her. And when the men from the county asked questions, the answers didn't match. And that was that. People learned to keep their mouths shut. It was safer. Safer. That word is always the one that reveals what kind of story you're in. When a town says silence is safer than truth, it means truth has consequences. It means there is a price for insisting that a person is a person. The clerk sat with the closed ledger in front of him and realized the real problem was not whether the child existed. The problem was that the census now insisted she did, and the rest of the county's paperwork insisted she did not. And somewhere between those two positions lived the machinery that could destroy a family for making the wrong kind of noise. The clerk could erase the line. He could call it a clerical error, scratch it out, and pretend it never happened. That would be the simplest path. But the margin note verified made that dangerous, because it meant someone important had already looked at this and decided it should remain. And in those offices, you didn't write verified unless you wanted future hands to stop trembling when they considered removing it. So the clerk did what bureaucracies do when confronted with a contradiction that feels like a trap. He escalated it. He requested the enumerator's field notes. He asked for the original schedule sheets, the pages written by hand as the census taker went door to door. And when those sheets arrived, folded and tied with string, the clerk saw something that made his mouth go dry. The child's name was not written in as an afterthought. It was part of the original count. Same ink, same pressure, same confidence. The enumerator had written her down as if he had seen her with his own eyes. But at the bottom of the page, in a separate section reserved for remarks, the enumerator had added a sentence, shaky compared to his usual script, as if his hand had stiffened while writing it. Household insists child is present. Neighbors disagree. Instructed to record as stated. Further review requested. The clerk read it twice. The household insists. Neighbors disagree. Instructed to record as stated. Further review requested. The paper was admitting that reality had fractured, and it had been told to pick a side, and once the side was chosen, it would not be neutral. It would be enforced. The clerk sat there with the field sheets spread like a map of trouble and understood that the story had already begun before he ever opened the ledger. Someone had insisted. Someone had denied. Someone had ordered the record to proceed anyway, and now the county held an official line declaring a 9-year-old girl existed, while every document that should have protected her existence refused to confirm her beginning. That is the kind of contradiction that does not stay small. That is the kind of contradiction that makes men show up at doors with questions that sound polite and are not. That is the kind of contradiction that makes a town choose whether it will tell the truth or protect itself or protect whatever it has already agreed to protect. And this is where we return to the most important detail, the one the clerk could not explain and did not want to, the word verified. Because it meant the system had already touched this child, and the system had decided the child belonged to the system's version of reality, not the family's, not the town's, and not whatever silent truth had been kept out of the birth books. The clerk had a choice to make. He could treat the entry like a problem to be corrected or like a warning to be understood. He chose understanding, not because he was brave, but because he could not bear the feeling of being lied to by ink. He gathered the relevant books, the birth register, the church ledger, the school roster, and the census schedule sheets, and he carried them into the courthouse vault where the air was cooler and the walls felt like they held secrets in their mortar. He laid them out on a table and began to build a timeline the way investigators do, because when paper contradicts paper, someone is lying, and the question is, who has the power to make their lie permanent? And in that vault, alone with documents that didn't agree on whether a child had ever entered the world, the clerk did not yet know the name of the force he had started to pull against. He only knew this: if a girl could appear in the census without being born, then the record was not merely recording life, it was creating it. And if it could create a life on paper, it could also erase one. It could do both, depending on what was needed. The clerk began where the system always tells you to begin, with the family. Not because families are the most reliable source of truth, but because they are the first place responsibility can be shifted. If the record is wrong, it is convenient to suggest that someone lied inside a house rather than admit that the machinery outside it malfunctioned. The address listed in the census sat at the edge of town, where the road narrowed and the houses leaned closer together, as if for mutual support. The clerk did not announce himself with authority. He did not arrive with a deputy. He arrived with a notebook and the posture of a man hoping to confirm a minor error. The door was answered by a woman whose age was difficult to place, not because she was unusual, but because labor had erased the markers people used to guess. Her hands bore the signs of work that does not stop when the sun goes down. She listened without interrupting as the clerk explained that there was a discrepancy in the census and that he needed to ask a few questions. When he reached the part about the child, the woman did not react the way people do when confronted with a lie they have told. There was no surprise. There was no defensive outrage. There was only a pause long enough to be deliberate. "You wrote her down," she said. It was not a question. The clerk nodded. "Then she's there," the woman said. "That's how it works." The clerk felt the ground shift slightly under the rules he thought he understood. He asked the next question carefully. "When was she born?" The woman did not answer immediately. She looked past him, down the road, as if checking whether the town was listening. Then she said, "She came when she came." It was not evasion. It was defiance dressed as calm. The clerk tried another approach, one that usually worked. There should be a record, a midwife, a church entry, something. The woman's mouth tightened, not with fear, but with a kind of exhausted recognition. "You don't get records when you aren't supposed to stay," she said. That was the sentence that changed the direction of the inquiry, not because it was dramatic, but because it acknowledged a rule the clerk had never seen written down. Some people were not supposed to stay. Some lives were conditional, tolerated until they weren't. He asked if the child was present now. The woman hesitated, then nodded toward the back of the house. The clerk followed, conscious of how small his shoes sounded on the floorboards. The room was dim, the window partly covered, not out of neglect but habit. And there, sitting on the edge of a bed too large for her, was the girl from the census. She looked up as they entered, not startled, not shy, but assessing. The clerk would later struggle to describe what unsettled him most in that moment, because it was not her appearance. It was the way she watched him, the way people watch things that can decide something. She was the right age. She was solid. She breathed. She existed in every sense the clerk could test with his own eyes. He asked her name. She answered. He asked her age. She answered. He asked where she went to school. She did not answer. The woman stepped in then, voice steady. "She doesn't." The clerk nodded, wrote it down, and felt the familiar impulse to make the situation manageable by converting it into categories. He asked when the family had arrived in town. The woman answered with a date that matched other records. He asked how many children she had. The woman hesitated again, then said the number that included the girl. The clerk noticed something that would bother him later. The woman never said the girl's name when answering questions that involved counts or lists. She spoke it only when speaking to the child herself, quietly, almost privately, as if the name behaved differently depending on who heard it. The clerk returned to the courthouse with the uncomfortable certainty that the census entry was not a fabrication. The girl existed. The problem was that the system had not been built to admit her in the usual way. He began to understand that the absence of a birth record was not an oversight. It was a condition. Someone had decided at the moment of her arrival that the safest course was to leave her unmarked. Not invisible, but untraceable. A life that could be acknowledged locally and denied officially, depending on which version of reality was being enforced. He turned next to the midwife registry, such as it was. In towns like this, midwives were known even when they were not licensed. They left marks in the margins of official books, notes in pencil, and initials without explanation. He found the name he expected, the woman who had attended half the births in the county for 30 years. He went to her house, expecting resistance or evasion. Instead, he found resignation. The midwife did not pretend not to know the child. She did not pretend not to remember the night. She told the story the way people do when they have told it to themselves many times, but never out loud. The birth had been difficult. The timing had been wrong. There had been a man present who should not have been there, and others absent who usually would be. There had been a discussion afterward, not about the health of the child, but about the future of the household. The midwife had been paid to keep her book closed, not with money that could be traced, but with promises that were easier to enforce: work, protection, silence. The clerk asked why the church had no record. The midwife gave a small laugh that held no humor. "You don't baptize what you plan to deny," she said. The clerk felt the pieces beginning to arrange themselves into something that resembled intention. The girl had been born into a situation that made her presence inconvenient. Her existence threatened arrangements that depended on ambiguity. The solution had not been to harm her. It had been to remove her from the official narrative of how people came into being, to allow her to live without allowing her to begin. The clerk returned to his office and read the census instructions again, looking for the clause that explained what to do when reality refused to cooperate. He found none. The census demanded accuracy, but it also demanded compliance. When an enumerator was instructed to record as stated, it meant authority had intervened. Someone higher up had decided that the risk of not counting the child was greater than the risk of counting her. Why would that be? The clerk requested correspondence related to the census operation that year. It took time. Letters moved slowly when no one wanted them to arrive. But eventually, a packet came from the state office. Inside was a letter from a supervisor responding to a query from the enumerator. The handwriting was brisk, confident, and impatient. If the household affirms presence and no legal impediment is evident, record accordingly. Do not investigate beyond scope. The census is not a court. The clerk stared at the sentence that would later be repeated to justify much worse things. The census is not a court. It did not judge origins. It did not arbitrate legitimacy. It recorded what was placed in front of it and moved on. And yet, by recording, it conferred reality. The girl had crossed a threshold without permission. She had become official without being sanctioned. And now the system that had reluctantly acknowledged her had to decide what to do with a person who existed on paper but could not be traced backward into acceptability. The clerk understood then that the danger was not to the census. It was to the girl, because systems tolerate anomalies only until they threaten order. And once order is threatened, the response is never neutral. By winter, the town had begun to adjust around the contradiction the way towns always do when something cannot be erased but also cannot be spoken about directly. People learned which questions not to ask. They learned which doors closed a little faster when certain footsteps approached. They learned that the girl existed in the same way a fault line exists, acknowledged only by those who understood what pressure could do. The clerk felt this shift most acutely inside the courthouse, where conversations that once took place in open rooms now occurred in corners and low voices. He noticed it in the way papers were handled, how certain files were passed hand to hand instead of being placed on desks, and how names were sometimes referred to by position or description rather than spoken aloud. He had not meant to create this atmosphere. He had meant to reconcile records, but reconciliation implied that something was wrong, and wrongness is contagious when it touches authority. The first official response came not as an accusation, but as a suggestion. A letter arrived from the county attorney, written in careful language that pretended neutrality while implying consequences. It noted that the presence of a child without proper documentation could create confusion in tax rolls, school funding allocations, and future inheritance disputes. It suggested that clarification would be in everyone's best interest. The clerk read between the lines easily. Clarification meant removal, not of the child from the house, but of the child from the paper. The attorney requested a meeting. It took place in a room with the door closed and the blinds half drawn, as if the daylight itself might take notes. The attorney spoke first, framing the situation as an unfortunate clerical complication. He suggested that the census enumerator had likely misunderstood a household arrangement, perhaps mistaking a visiting relative or a boarder for a permanent resident. The clerk listened and said nothing until the attorney finished. Then he said quietly that he had seen the child. He said that the enumerator had seen the child. He said that the household insisted and that the census had been verified by the state. The attorney's face did not change, but his tone did. "Seeing isn't the same as knowing," he said. "And knowing isn't the same as proving." The clerk replied that the census did not require proof of birth, only residence. The attorney smiled thinly. "The census requires whatever the county decides it requires," he said, and there it was. The system is revealing its flexibility. The clerk was told that an amendment could be filed, a correction appended. The child could be removed retroactively, classified as an error. No one would be punished. No one would be embarrassed. The books would agree again. The clerk asked what would happen to the family if that occurred. The attorney said the census was not responsible for household outcomes. It recorded it. It did not cause it. The clerk heard again the phrase he had come to distrust. Not responsible, not a court, not accountable. He left the meeting with the distinct sense that a decision was being staged elsewhere and that his role was expected to be administrative obedience. Over the next weeks, pressure arrived indirectly. The clerk's workload increased. Requests piled up. Errors that had never mattered before were suddenly flagged for correction. He was reminded, subtly, and then less so, that his position depended on the county's confidence. Meanwhile, the family at the edge of town noticed changes too. Neighbors who had once spoken freely now crossed the street. The grocer delayed service. The schoolmaster asked questions that sounded polite and were not. Men lingered near the house in the evenings, not threatening, just present. The girl noticed all of it. She had learned early that attention was a kind of weather. She learned to sit farther from windows. She learned to speak less in public. She learned that her name carried different weight depending on who heard it. The woman who cared for her began keeping a bag packed. Not because she planned to leave, but because preparedness was the only form of control left. The clerk received another letter, this one from the state office, following up on the earlier verification. It asked whether the discrepancy had been resolved. The clerk realized then that the state did not care which version prevailed, only that one version did. Systems do not like unresolved tension. They do not tolerate dual truths. He was being given an opportunity to collapse the contradiction quietly. He asked for time. He began to assemble copies of every document related to the case, not because he planned to publish them, but because he understood something that had not been taught to him. Paper only protects you if you have more of it than the person trying to erase you. He kept the copies in his home, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath floorboards. He did not tell his wife why. He did not tell anyone. The next escalation came through the school board. A notice was posted reminding residents that children of compulsory age were required to attend or be accounted for. The family received a visit. The girl was asked to demonstrate knowledge she had never been allowed to acquire officially. Her answers were judged against standards designed to exclude. The conclusion was foregone. She was declared unfit for enrollment. Not incapable, but inappropriate. The wording mattered. Inappropriate meant she did not belong in the category the system was prepared to manage. The clerk watched these developments with growing unease. He saw how the problem was being reframed, no longer a question of records, but of order. The girl was becoming an inconvenience that justified intervention, and intervention, once justified, rarely remained proportionate. The clerk received word unofficially that a welfare inquiry was being discussed. He knew what that meant. Removal under the guise of protection. Placement into a system that specialized in forgetting. He went back to the ledger and stared at the line that had started everything. The neat handwriting, the confidence, the audacity of existence declared. He realized then that the census had done something extraordinary without intending to. It had made the girl legible to power. And power does not respond kindly to legibility it did not authorize. He went to the family again, this time not as a clerk, but as a witness. He told the woman what was coming, not in detail, but enough. She listened without interruption, then asked a question that surprised him. "Can they erase her?" The clerk hesitated. "They can erase the record," he said. The woman nodded slowly. "Then they'll try to erase her," she said. It was not fear. It was a calculation. She asked him what he could do. He did not have a good answer. He could stall. He could document. He could refuse to file the amendment. But refusal would be temporary. Someone else would be appointed. The system did not depend on individuals. It replaced them. The woman asked if the census line could protect the girl. The clerk answered honestly. "It cuts both ways," he said. "It proves she exists, and it gives them a reason to control how." That night, the clerk did not sleep. He understood that he was standing at the edge of something that would move whether he acted or not. The machinery was already engaged. The question was whether there would be a trace left behind when it finished. The removal did not come with violence. That is the detail people often misunderstand when they imagine how systems enforce their will. It came with forms. It came with polite men who introduced themselves and removed their hats indoors. It came with language that framed the act as assistance rather than extraction. The notice arrived first, folded neatly, stamped with authority that looked ordinary enough to be trusted. It stated that the county had concerns about the welfare and proper supervision of a minor whose legal status remained unclear. It cited statutes that most people never read and would not have understood even if they had. It requested cooperation. The woman read the notice twice, then folded it and placed it beneath a plate on the table as if to hold it down. The girl watched her carefully, absorbing the shape of the moment. She had learned to recognize when adults stopped pretending. The men arrived 2 days later. They did not raise their voices. They did not accuse. They spoke as if everything had already been decided somewhere else and their presence was merely procedural. The clerk was not among them. He heard about it afterward from a neighbor who used the same tone people use when reporting weather damage, as if no one was responsible and nothing could be done. The men said the girl would be taken temporarily for assessment. That word again. Assessment. A holding pattern disguised as care. They said the county needed to understand her circumstances. They said she would be returned once clarity was achieved. They said cooperation would make the process smoother. The woman asked where they would take her. They gave the name of an institution in the next county, one that specialized in children who did not fit neatly into existing categories. The woman asked if she could come. They said not at first. The girl asked one question. She asked if her name would stay in the book. The men did not understand why the question mattered. They said the census was a separate matter. The girl nodded, as if confirming something she had already suspected. She did not cry when they took her. That frightened the woman more than screaming would have. The house felt smaller afterward, not because someone was missing, but because the rules had changed. The clerk learned of the removal that evening. He went to the ledger and placed his hand on the page, a gesture that would have embarrassed him if anyone had seen it. He understood then that the census entry had done exactly what power does when it recognizes something it cannot classify. It had pulled the girl into a process that would continue until she either conformed or disappeared from relevance. He requested records from the institution, citing his role in resolving the discrepancy. He received a reply that thanked him for his interest and informed him that the matter was under review by appropriate authorities. Appropriate. Another word that concealed distance. Weeks passed. The family received limited information. The girl was being evaluated. She was adjusting. She was receiving care. The woman was allowed one supervised, timed visit. The girl appeared thinner, quieter, not broken, but alert in a way that suggested constant monitoring. She spoke carefully, choosing words that could not be turned against her. She did not complain. She did not accuse. She asked about the census. The woman told her it was still there. The girl closed her eyes for a moment, not in relief, but in concentration. The clerk continued to gather paper. He documented the removal. He noted the justifications. He wrote down names. He copied letters. He became, without ever naming it as such, an archivist of a life that the system was trying to redefine. He received a directive from the county attorney instructing him to finalize the census amendment. He refused, citing the ongoing review. The refusal was noted. His position became precarious. The pressure increased. The state office sent a second letter. The institution sent a report describing the girl in language that reduced her to traits and risks. She was described as difficult to categorize, as resistant to instruction, as possessing an unusual awareness of her situation. The report recommended continued supervision. Indefinitely, the clerk read the report and recognized the pattern. Once someone is labeled as difficult to categorize, the category becomes the problem. The girl was no longer a child with missing paperwork. She was an administrative anomaly that justified containment. The woman visited again. The girl asked the same question. The woman gave the same answer. The clerk began to understand that the census line had become a lifeline. As long as it remained, the girl could not be fully erased. She existed in a federal document. That mattered. It did not protect her from harm, but it complicated the narrative. It meant there was a record that could be pointed to, cited, and used. The clerk made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He sent copies of the documentation to a contact he trusted in another county, a man who had once questioned an audit and survived. He framed it not as an accusation, but as a curiosity, a discrepancy worth noting. The response did not come quickly, but when it did, it asked questions the county had avoided. On what authority had the removal occurred? Why had the census been verified without supporting records? Who had ordered the enumerator to proceed? The questions did not accuse, but they destabilized. The county attorney learned of the inquiry and understood the risk. The clerk was called in again. This time, the tone was sharper. He was reminded of his obligations. He was reminded that careers ended quietly. He was reminded that order mattered more than individual cases. The clerk listened and said nothing. He had learned that silence was sometimes the only way to keep a record intact. Meanwhile, the girl waited. Institutions are designed to stretch time. Days blur. Visits become markers rather than continuity. She learned the routines. She learned which behaviors drew attention and which allowed invisibility. She learned that compliance could be strategic. She did not forget the census. She repeated her name to herself at night, not as comfort, but as rehearsal. Somewhere, on a page she could not see, her existence was still declared. That mattered. It mattered because systems rarely reverse themselves without external pressure. And pressure requires something to push against. The inquiry from the neighboring county did not resolve anything immediately. It did something more dangerous. It slowed the machinery. When systems expect compliance and receive questions instead, they hesitate, not out of doubt, but out of calculation. The county attorney began to speak less confidently about timelines. Letters took longer to answer. The institution revised its language, softening certain phrases and adding qualifiers that suggested caution rather than certainty. None of this improved the girl's daily reality. She remained confined to schedules and supervision, her movements observed, her words noted. But the tone around her shifted from certainty to management. She was no longer being moved toward a conclusion. She was being held in place while people above her decided what kind of precedent she represented. The clerk sensed this shift and understood that time, which had once worked against the girl, might now be the only leverage available. He continued to refuse the census amendment, citing unresolved review. The state office sent a representative. Not an investigator, not yet, but an observer. A man whose task was to report, not intervene. The clerk welcomed him, laid out the documents, and let the contradictions speak. The observer asked a few questions and took careful notes. Before leaving, he said something that the clerk would replay often. "Records don't like uncertainty," he said. "They eventually choose a shape." The clerk asked which shape this would take. The observer did not answer. The woman visited the institution again. The girl looked different this time, not diminished, but sharpened. She had learned how to exist inside rules without surrendering to them. She answered questions carefully. She followed routines precisely. She had become legible in the way institutions demand. The woman worried this meant something worse. The girl explained it simply. "If they think I fit," she said, "they stop looking so hard." The woman asked if she was afraid. The girl shook her head. "I don't want them to decide who I am," she said. "I want the paper to say it." That was when the woman understood that the census had become more than a document. It was an argument. The institution sent a recommendation to the county. It suggested long-term placement. It framed the girl as a case requiring stability and oversight. The clerk obtained a copy through channels he no longer pretended were official. He read it and saw the familiar strategy. If removal could not be justified as temporary, it would be justified as permanent care. The girl would become an institutional fact rather than a civic one. Her existence would be absorbed into a system that did not require birth records or census entries to function. The clerk realized that if that happened, the census line would lose its power. It would become an artifact rather than a claim. He needed the discrepancy to surface publicly, not as a scandal, but as a contradiction. He sent copies of the census page and the institution's report to the state office with a cover letter that asked a simple question. How does the state reconcile a verified census entry with an indefinite removal based on undocumented origin? The response was not immediate. It was also not private. The state office forwarded the question to legal counsel. Legal counsel forwarded it to a committee. The committee requested clarification from the county. The county requested time. Time bought the girl another season. The woman noticed changes in town. People spoke more freely again, not because they were brave, but because uncertainty had spread upward. When authority hesitates, silence loosens. The girl's name began to appear in conversations again, cautiously. The clerk was warned informally that his position was under review. He accepted this. He had reached the point where retreat would undo everything he had preserved. He received a letter from the state office requesting the original census ledger for inspection. This was unprecedented. The ledger had not left the courthouse in decades. The county attorney protested. The request stood. The clerk packed the ledger himself, handling it as one might handle a fragile body. He accompanied it to the Capitol. In a room far larger than his office, the ledger was placed on a table and opened to the page. The officials present did not gasp. They did not react. They did something more unsettling. They debated the procedure. They debated jurisdiction. They debated whether the census had overstepped. They debated whether the removal had been appropriate. The girl was not present. She did not need to be. Her life was being negotiated by men who spoke of her as a case. The clerk listened until he was invited to speak. He said only one thing. He said that the census had done its job. It had recorded a resident. Everything that followed had been an attempt to undo that fact without admitting why. He said that if the state allowed a verified census entry to be nullified by administrative discomfort, then the census itself was meaningless. The room went quiet, not because they agreed, but because the argument could not be dismissed easily. The committee adjourned without a decision. The ledger was returned. The girl remained in the institution. But something had changed. The system could no longer pretend the contradiction did not exist, and contradictions, once acknowledged, demand resolution. The resolution did not arrive with an announcement. It arrived as a recalibration. Institutions rarely reverse themselves outright. They adjust, they reinterpret, they reframe. And when they do, the people inside those decisions feel the change long before it becomes visible on paper. The first sign was small. The girl was permitted to receive books again, not just instructional texts approved by staff, but volumes brought by the woman, returned without inspection. The second sign was procedural. Her evaluations stopped escalating. No new recommendations were added to her file. Notes became shorter, less speculative, and more observational. Language shifted from corrective to neutral. The staff did not explain this. They did not need to. The girl understood that she had moved from anomaly to inconvenience. She was no longer something to be solved immediately. She was something that might require explanation later. That distinction mattered. The clerk, meanwhile, felt the pressure increase. His superiors did not accuse him directly. They asked questions about his future plans. They hinted at opportunities elsewhere. They reminded him that loyalty was noticed. He responded politely and continued to do his work. He knew that his position was temporary now, not because he had failed, but because he had made himself visible. He also knew that visibility was the only reason the girl still existed on the page. The state office issued a request for supplemental documentation regarding the removal. It was phrased carefully, framed as routine oversight. The county complied slowly. The institution was delayed. Each delay stretched the timeline further into discomfort. The census year had ended. Preparations for the next cycle had begun. And still, the line remained unresolved. The woman received permission to bring the girl home for supervised visits. At first, they were brief. An afternoon. A meal. A walk that did not stray beyond view. The girl walked through the town as if she were relearning its dimensions. Some people looked away. Others nodded. No one spoke to her directly. She did not expect them to. She was no longer seeking recognition. She was measuring the return. On one of those visits, she asked to see the courthouse. The woman hesitated, then agreed. They stood outside. The clerk was visible through the window, bent over his desk. The girl watched him for a long moment. She did not wave. She did not enter. She said only that she wanted to remember where her name had stayed. The clerk received formal notice 2 weeks later. His term would not be renewed. The letter thanked him for his service and cited restructuring. He folded it, placed it in the ledger drawer, and finished his day. He left the courthouse without ceremony. The next morning, he returned as a citizen. He asked to view the census ledger. The request was denied. He expected this. He did not argue. He had already done what he needed to do. The girl's supervised visits became longer, then unsupervised, then regular. The institution revised her status quietly. She was no longer classified under observation. She was listed as pending resolution. That phrase appeared nowhere else in the records. It meant that no one wanted to make the next decision. The state office sent a final inquiry. It asked whether the county intended to formalize the removal retroactively or acknowledge the census entry as binding. The county did not respond. Silence, in this case, was a choice. Months passed. The next census approached. The girl turned another year older. She attended school locally under an arrangement that was described as provisional. She learned quickly what could be spoken and what could not. She did not tell anyone about the institution unless asked. She did not describe the nights there. She focused on presence, on continuity, on being counted in ways that did not require explanation. The clerk found work elsewhere. He did not follow the case publicly. He did not write about it. He trusted that the contradiction he had preserved would do its work without him. The woman watched the girl adapt and worried about the cost of that adaptation. The girl seemed older than she should have been, not in manner, but in awareness. She knew that her life existed within margins others could erase if provoked. She chose caution not out of fear, but strategy. The next census arrived. A new enumerator came. He carried a fresh book. He asked the standard questions. When he reached the household, he asked for names. The woman answered. The girl waited. Her name was written again. This time, no one objected. There was no letter, no inquiry, no removal. The system had chosen a shape. It had decided that acknowledging her existence was less disruptive than contesting it again. The earlier discrepancy remained unresolved in archives, a quiet scar in the record. But the present had moved forward. The girl was no longer an anomaly. She was a continuation. Years later, a historian would notice the irregularity. A single line that appeared without origin and persisted despite challenge. It would prompt questions that could no longer be answered. The people involved would be gone. The motives are undocumented. The resolution is informal. But the fact remains. A girl appeared in the census who was never born, according to the records that mattered to power. And yet, she lived. By the time the historian encountered the line, it had already done its quiet work. It sat in the ledger without commentary, uncorrected, uncelebrated, and unremarked upon by anyone who had authority to explain it. That was how most truths survived in official memory. Not as declarations, but as residues. The historian was not looking for anomalies that day. He was tracing demographic movement across rural districts, a study intended to support a broader argument about migration and labor. The ledger was one of many. He had learned to read past the ink, to sense when something resisted classification. When his finger paused on the entry, it was not because the name was unfamiliar. It was because the absence around it felt deliberate. No preceding birth, no adjacent notation, no marginal correction. It was a presence without scaffolding. He copied it into his notes without comment and moved on. That night, he returned to it. He pulled surrounding documents, church registers, property rolls, court minutes. Each source produced fragments, none conclusive. The girl appeared in school attendance records under a provisional arrangement. She appeared in a local census draft as verified. She did not appear in baptismal logs. She did not appear in hospital admissions after the institutional revision. She existed in motion, not in origin. The historian understood then that the ledger was not the mystery. The system was. The system had allowed an error to stand because correcting it would have required admission, and admission would have required responsibility. In the town, the girl grew into a young woman who understood how silence functioned. She did not volunteer stories. She answered questions directly when asked. She learned which adults had been there and which had arrived after. She learned which rooms held memory and which had been repainted. She learned that survival did not require explanation, only consistency. Her schooling continued under watchful tolerance. Teachers marked her work carefully. They did not praise excessively. They did not challenge unnecessarily. She sensed the agreement beneath their behavior. She was permitted as long as she did not require defense. The woman remained vigilant. She kept documents in a drawer, not as proof, but as a reminder. She understood that proof was not what protected them. Familiarity did. The clerk, now settled elsewhere, followed the census updates when they were published. He read the tables, the summaries, and the aggregated narratives that erased individuals into trends. He did not expect to find her name again. When he did, listed without asterisk, without footnote, without question, he closed the paper and sat quietly. He felt neither triumph nor relief, only confirmation. The institution released a revised manual the following year. It clarified procedures for discrepancies. It emphasized cross-verification. It included language about preventing unauthorized entries. It did not reference past errors. The change was preventative, not corrective. The girl's earlier removal was never acknowledged. The manual made future contradictions less likely. That was the system's version of accountability. Years passed. The girl left the town for a time, then returned. She carried with her a sharpened awareness of how easily people accepted the given story when it was tidy. She learned to navigate forms and to answer questions in ways that closed doors gently rather than slammed them. She learned that the most dangerous answer was an honest one delivered without preparation. She worked, she paid taxes, she voted when permitted. Each action reinforced her place in the present tense. The earlier absence receded into abstraction. In the archive, the anomaly remained. Other historians noticed it, then dismissed it. A clerical error, a misfiled name, a quirk of enumeration. No one followed it through. Doing so would have required confronting how institutions corrected themselves by omission rather than repair. In the town, stories softened with retelling. The girl had been sick, some said, or orphaned, or taken in by relatives. The woman did not correct them. Correction invited scrutiny. She understood that the most effective lie was not fabrication but simplification. The girl, now older, understood something else. She understood that her life had been stabilized not by benevolence, but by fatigue. The system had tired of pursuing her erasure. It had chosen to move on. That choice was fragile. It depended on her continued compliance with invisibility. She complied selectively. She spoke when silence would harm others. She withheld when speech would invite punishment. She did not mistake this for freedom. She understood it as a truce. The historian eventually published his findings without reference to the anomaly. It did not fit his thesis. He kept his notes. Years later, another researcher would request access. The file would be opened again. The line would be seen again. Each time, it would ask the same question. Not who the girl was, but why the system allowed her to remain once it had decided she should not exist. The answer was not written. It lived in the accumulation of small decisions made by people who chose not to escalate, a clerk who did not erase, an office that was delayed, an institution that revised language rather than admit fault, a town that preferred continuity to correction. The girl became a woman who lived long enough to see the world change its vocabulary. She heard new words used to describe old practices. She recognized them. She knew that language evolved faster than accountability. When she died, there was a notice. It listed her age. It listed her residence. It did not list her birth. No one questioned it. The census had already done its work. The woman was buried under a name that had learned to survive. It appeared on a stone in a small cemetery where markers were uneven and dates were sometimes approximated. No birth year was carved, only an age at death calculated backward from paperwork that had long since stopped questioning itself. The stone did not lie. It simply repeated what the system had decided was sufficient. Those who attended the burial spoke quietly, not out of reverence alone, but out of habit. Silence had been a teacher in that town for generations. It had taught people when to look away and when to accept what was placed in front of them as complete. After the burial, the town moved on, as towns always do, by absorbing loss into routine. The house where the woman had lived was sold. The drawer where documents had once been kept was emptied, its contents divided between practicality and sentiment. Some papers were burned. Others were folded into boxes labeled vaguely and stored in attics where meaning decayed slowly. Years later, a descendant of the historian would find the notes. They would not know why the anomaly had been circled twice, underlined once, then left alone. They would assume it was an abandoned lead, an early curiosity that did not mature into an argument. They would be wrong, but not culpably so. The archive trains its readers to privilege resolution. Unresolved things are treated as errors of method rather than signals of truth. In the broader record, the period was summarized as an administrative transition. Reports spoke of modernization, of improved enumeration, of increased accuracy. The language was confident. It framed the past as disordered and the present as corrected. Nowhere did it mention the cost of correction. Nowhere did it account for those who had been removed, not because they were inaccurate, but because they were inconvenient. The census entry from 1893 remained unchanged in the master ledger. It was copied forward mechanically, each iteration inheriting its authority from the last. Over time, the anomaly lost its edge. It became normalized by repetition. What begins as contradiction can, through enough quiet acceptance, become fact. This is how systems heal themselves. Not by repair, but by endurance. In academic circles, discussions of historical omission often centered on intent. Who decided? Who ordered? Who signed? This case resisted that framing. There was no single villain, no dramatic directive, no explicit decree. The erasure had been enacted through process, through the cumulative effect of people doing their jobs within boundaries they did not design. The clerk who first removed the girl likely believed he was correcting an error. The supervisor who approved it likely believed he was maintaining order. The office that failed to follow up likely believed the matter resolved itself. Each action was small. Together, they constituted disappearance. The woman, had she been asked to explain herself, would not have spoken of injustice in abstract terms. She would have described moments. The day she was told not to return to the office, the afternoon her name failed to appear on a list she had checked the week before. The way her mother's posture changed when she realized the argument would not be heard. She would have described how quickly people adjusted to her absence and how easily they accepted the revised story. She would have described the strange relief that followed survival, the way fear gives way to vigilance, and vigilance becomes routine. The town never apologized because it never admitted harm. Harm that is not named cannot be addressed. This was not cruelty born of malice, but of structure. The structure is more durable. It does not require belief, only compliance. When the next census was conducted, decades later, enumerators were trained differently. They were told to verify. They were given clearer protocols. The system congratulated itself. It did not look back. It rarely does. Looking back requires acknowledging that improvement is often built on unacknowledged loss. In the quiet hours, when no one was watching, the woman had sometimes imagined speaking publicly. She imagined telling the story plainly, without accusation, without ornament. She imagined describing how a life could be paused by ink and resumed only through exhaustion. She never did. She understood that truth, when delivered without protection, becomes another vulnerability. She chose instead to live as evidence. Evidence is quieter than testimony. It accumulates slowly. It cannot be dismissed easily once it has aged. The historian's notes would eventually be digitized. The ledger would be scanned. The line would be visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Some would notice it. Most would not. A few would pause, feel the faint resistance of something unresolved, then move on. That, too, was part of the system. The story did not end with exposure. It ended with persistence. With a name that remained. With a life that refused to be fully erased even when its origin had been denied. The question that remained was not how the error occurred, but why its correction was never prioritized. The answer lay not in malice, but in hierarchy. Some lives, once removed, do not create enough disruption to require restoration. They are absorbed into silence. They are treated as statistical noise. The woman had understood this intuitively. She had lived accordingly. Her survival was not defiance in the dramatic sense. It was defiance through continuity, through remaining, through insisting on presence in a world that had decided she was optional. The census line from 1893 still exists. It can be found by those who know where to look. It does not explain itself. It does not need to. It stands as a quiet indictment of a system that prefers clean records to complicated truths. It asks a single, uncomfortable question of anyone who encounters it. Not whether the girl was real, but how many others were made unreal without leaving a trace. By the time public historians began speaking openly about archival violence, the woman's life had already been folded into abstraction. Panels discussed erasure as a concept. Papers described disappearance as a process. The language was careful, professional, and buffered by distance. Few spoke about the mechanics of survival inside a system that had already decided you were expendable. Fewer still asked what endurance costs when it is mistaken for consent. The ledger entry from 1893 circulated occasionally in lectures as an example. It was anonymized. Its specificity softened. It became illustrative rather than accusatory. The girl was no longer a person but a case. The system prefers cases. They are easier to hold than lives. In the town, memory thinned as witnesses aged and died. The people who had known the woman in her later years remembered her as reserved, competent, and unremarkable in a way that suggests deliberate self-effacement. They did not know the architecture of fear that had shaped her habits. They did not know that her caution was not temperament, but strategy. They assumed she had always been there, which was the final irony. After fighting to exist, she had succeeded so completely that her existence was taken for granted. This is how erasure completes itself, not by disappearance, but by normalization without acknowledgement. In the archives, the census books were moved to controlled storage. Climate regulation preserved the paper. Digital copies preserved the text. What could not be preserved was context. The hesitation of the clerk. The silence of the office. The calculation behind deciding not to revisit the removal. Those things were never written down. They did not need to be. They were encoded in procedure. The system does not rely on memory. It relies on repetition. Each generation of administrators inherited a version of reality that appeared internally consistent. To question it required effort, risk, and incentive. There was little incentive. The anomaly harmed no one who mattered to those in power. That was the unspoken calculus. The woman's life intersected with others who carried similar fractures. They recognized each other not through shared stories, but through shared restraint. They understood how to read pauses in conversation, how to sense when a question was dangerous, and how to answer without inviting follow-up. They did not form movements. Movements attract attention. They formed patterns. Patterns are harder to police. In later years, the woman volunteered occasionally, quietly, in roles that required trust but did not confer authority. She knew better than to seek positions that required vetting. Vetting resurrects records. Records remember what people wish to forget. She avoided anything that would require a birth certificate beyond what already existed. She lived within the perimeter of what had been allowed to stand. This was not cowardice. It was precision. The historian who first noticed the anomaly died believing he had failed to pursue something important. He left instructions that his notes be preserved. He did not explain why. He may not have fully understood it himself. Intuition often precedes articulation. The descendant who found the notes felt a similar pull, but lived in a different era. An era that spoke fluently about injustice, but still struggled to assign responsibility. They considered writing about it. They drafted outlines. They hesitated. Publication would require framing. Framing would require claims. Claims would require proof. Proof would require exposure. Exposure would reopen a wound the system had carefully sealed. They wondered whether reopening it would do more harm than silence. This is how the system recruits its critics, by forcing them to choose between incomplete justice and unintended consequence. The census entry remained unchanged. It did not need defense. Its authority came from age. Age confers legitimacy even when it masks error. People trust what has lasted. They assume endurance equals correctness. The woman had lived long enough to understand this inversion. She knew that the longer a lie persists, the harder it is to dislodge, not because it is convincing, but because it is familiar. Familiarity breeds compliance. In her final years, she spoke once, briefly, to someone who asked the wrong question at the wrong time. She did not correct them. She simply said that some lives are recorded backward, that the ending is what grants permission for the beginning. The listener did not understand. They nodded politely and changed the subject. The woman did not elaborate. She had learned when explanation was futile. The record of her life, as it stands, is complete enough to be accepted and incomplete enough to conceal its violence. That is the system's ideal outcome. It does not seek to eliminate people entirely. It seeks to render their origins irrelevant, to make questions about how they came to be seem unnecessary. The girl who appeared in the census without being born forced the system to choose between correction and convenience. It chose convenience. Everything that followed flowed from that decision. The lesson is not that the system is cruel in obvious ways. It is that it is efficient. It resolves contradictions by absorbing them, not addressing them. It relies on time to dull urgency. It counts on fatigue to replace outrage. It waits for witnesses to die. By the time anyone is ready to ask the right questions, the answers have been buried under layers of procedure. The woman's story does not end with vindication. There was no formal acknowledgement, no restored record, no institutional apology. It ends with continuity, with a life that existed anyway. That persistence is not a consolation prize. It is evidence. Evidence that even incomplete erasure leaves traces. That systems, no matter how thorough, cannot fully extinguish the people they fail to account for. The final accounting did not come in the form of a correction. There was no amended ledger, no stamped acknowledgement, and no public admission that a life had been misfiled and then allowed to proceed only after the system grew tired of correcting itself. What remained instead was a quiet accumulation of proof, scattered across years, embedded in ordinary transactions that had outlived the attempt to erase their origin. The woman had paid taxes. She had signed leases. She had appeared in voter rolls when permitted. Each act reinforced her presence in the present tense, even as the past remained unresolved. This is how survival outpaces denial, not by confrontation, but by persistence. The census line from 1893, once an anomaly, became the foundation upon which all subsequent recognition rested. The system did not restore what it had removed. It simply accepted what remained. That acceptance was not grace. It was inertia. Inertia favors what continues without disruption. The woman understood this instinctively. She lived in ways that did not demand explanation, only accommodation. Over time, accommodation hardened into assumption. The town assumed she had always been there. The records assumed continuity. The question of origin faded into irrelevance. This was the final transformation. The erasure became invisible because the life that followed was undeniable. In the archive, the documents remain. They can be read, they can be cross-referenced. They can be interpreted as error, oversight, or coincidence. What they cannot do on their own is explain the human cost of being temporarily unmade. That cost is not legible in ink. It is carried in behavior, in caution, and in the learned instinct to minimize one's footprint in systems that have demonstrated their willingness to delete. The woman did not seek recognition for what she endured. She did not frame her life as resistance. She framed it as maintenance. Maintenance of presence. Maintenance of dignity. Maintenance of a space that had been reluctantly granted and could be revoked if disturbed. This is not the version of heroism that histories prefer. It lacks spectacle. It does not resolve cleanly. It does not end with justice as defined by institutions. It ends with endurance. The ledger from 1893 still exists. It will outlast interpretations. Long after theories shift and language evolves, the line will remain, carrying its quiet contradiction forward. Anyone who looks closely enough can still find it. Anyone who understands systems can still read what it implies. It tells us that legitimacy is not always granted at birth. Sometimes it is negotiated retroactively, through survival, through fatigue, through the unwillingness of a system to reopen a problem it believes time has solved. The girl who appeared without being born did not ask to be proof. She became proof because the system left her no other role. Proof that records do not simply reflect reality, they create it. Proof that disappearance does not always require force. Sometimes it requires only a procedure. Proof that when a system decides someone should not exist, the most dangerous thing that person can do is continue anyway. This story does not ask for outrage. Outrage burns quickly and leaves little behind. It asks for attention, for the discipline to read what is present and also what is missing, for the willingness to question why some absences are corrected and others are allowed to stand. It asks us to consider how many lives have been quietly edited, not because they were false, but because they complicated the narrative institutions preferred to tell about themselves. The woman lived. That fact cannot be undone. The system adapted around her rather than admitting its error. That too cannot be undone. What remains is a choice for the living, whether to treat such stories as curiosities or as instructions. Instructions about where to look, what to question, and how easily a life can be altered by decisions made without cruelty, but with indifference. If you have followed this story from the first line in the ledger to its quiet conclusion, you have already done part of that work. You have stayed with something unresolved long enough to see how resolution is often denied, not through refusal, but through delay. That is not an accident. It is a feature, and understanding that feature is the first step toward ensuring it does not continue unchallenged. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that attention is a form of accountability and that remembering is an act of resistance against erasure, then stay with this work. Subscribe, not out of habit, but out of intention. These stories endure only when they are carried forward, examined, and refused the comfort of forgetting.